Hi, I'm Valerie, and this loaf of sourdough is one of my ideal finds. I'm going to show you today how I make my loaf of sourdough. I've been making this for almost 3 years now and probably make at least one, sometimes two loaves a week. It took quite a few tries before I actually got the perfect loaf. I started my starter in April of 2020, and it wasn't until probably June of 2020 before I actually got my first good loaf. I knew that I wanted to keep trying to make it, and so I was very persistent. It took several tries to get the perfect loaf, and I'm glad I stuck with it and kept trying because eventually I did. It took about 2 months to get a good loaf, and um, a lot of different techniques also. I started trying one specific technique and that didn't work out. So then I tried another different technique and that didn't work out. I tried a third one, that did not work out either. Then I ended up deciding to just take bits and pieces of different techniques that I had watched on YouTube or other videos or read blogs or whatever. And I took a little bit of information from each of those things and kind of created this process that works for me. Um, it's probably not going to work for you just because I couldn't find one specific process that worked for me either. But hopefully, you can find some bits and pieces of information out of this video that will help you to achieve the perfect loaf that you're looking for, also. Um, to start the process of making a loaf of sourdough, I would say that there's probably four key stages of the process. This is the process that starts with a healthy starter. So the first stage of the loaf of sourdough would be feeding the starter to get it frothy. The second stage will be using your frothy starter mixed with flour and water and salt. The third stage is the easy stage. That's where you just let it sit in the fridge for a couple hours or overnight, depending on how long you want to let it sit or how much time you have. And the fourth stage is baking. Right now, we're going to start with stage one and feeding our starter. I keep it in the fridge after, so I'll feed it and I'll use the frothy starter and then I immediately put it back in the fridge until the next time I use it. I don't ever feed it and discard just because I have never needed to do that. So my starter is stored in the fridge until I'm ready to use it. Depending on my timeline and how much time I have, sometimes I will pull my starter and my flour out of the fridge and freezer because I keep my flour in the freezer. Um, Sometimes I'll pull those out the night before I start making my bread. If it's room temperature, it seems to get frothier faster. But sometimes if I feed it at night and let it become frothy overnight to start mixing it first thing in the morning, then it doesn't really matter to me if it's still cold or not because I kind of need that extra time from, say, 11 o'clock at night until 6 or 7 in the morning when I actually start mixing it up. So but if I feed it in the morning, then and I want it to maybe only take 4 hours to become frothy rather than say 8 hours if it was cold, um, then I'll pull out my starter and my flour the night before, and then I'll mix it first thing in the morning. And I'll show you how I can kind of help that process along so that it speeds up the frothy stage of it. When I used my starter last time, I end up leaving about, maybe 2 tablespoons or so in the jar, and then that just goes in the fridge. So then I pull it out when I'm ready to use it again, and I mix in a half a cup of reverse osmosis water and 3/4 of a cup of all-purpose flour. So then I take this scraper and I just stir this up. and it kind of becomes thick like a pancake batter. And this jar that I have is actually just a straight-sided vase that I got at Walmart for probably $1. And I like the straight sides on it because I can use this type of a scraper. I had tried at one point to use a mason jar, but the corners up at the top just kind of got in the way. And so I wanted something that had straight sides on it. So I got this jar and this scraper, and that's how I do mine, and it seems to make it pretty easy for me. And then I have a lid here that I actually use to store on. It has my starter's name on it, John Favreau, and his birthday. So I put my lid on it, and I have the rubber band so that you can see where my starting line is on my starter, so that when it gets to be about double, and you can kind of see about where it has been in the past, when it gets to about that double size, then it's ready to be mixed into a loaf of bread. The starter will get frothier faster if it's in a warm and humid environment. So because I don't have a proofing box for that, I actually just use my microwave. I take my 2-cup measuring cup and fill it with water, and I heat the water up in the microwave until it's nice and humid in there, and then I just let my starter sit in there. After heating my water for 5 minutes in the microwave, I know that it's been boiling, and so it's nice and hot and humid in there. So I'm going to just keep my starter in there to get frothy in that warm and humid environment. And I'll come back probably every 20, 30, 45 minutes or so and take the starter out of the microwave, reheat the water, and then put the starter back in to just sit in the microwave in the hot and humid environment, because that will help get it frothy faster. So if you're starting with room temperature starter and flour and have a nice hot and humid environment like the microwave, and reheating the water every 30 to 45 minutes, my starter should be doubled and frothy enough in probably about 4 hours. If my starter and flour are cold from being in the fridge and freezer, and I don't reheat it every 30 to 45 minutes, then it will take about 8 hours to get to where it has doubled in size. So in the meantime, while that's getting frothy, then I'm going to prepare some of my other things. So I already have 2¼ cups of reverse osmosis water in my bowl, which is where we're going to be mixing the starter with the flour. So I have this already set aside and ready to go. And then in this little measuring cup, I have a little over 3 tablespoons of reverse osmosis water, and I'm going to put in a heaping tablespoon of finely ground pink sea salt. So I'll mix this up. The salt actually does not fully dissolve in the water by the time I use it, but I go ahead and mix it up now to give it some time to do some dissolving, but again, it's not going to fully dissolve before I need it. And I do not use a brand name flour. I just buy a 25-pound bag from Sam's, and I divide it up into Ziploc bags and store it in the freezer. I put 14 cups in each Ziploc bag, and that's enough to do 2 loaves per bag. I can probably get about 10 loaves of bread out of each bag of flour. When I first started doing this about 3 years ago, the flour was only about $6 a bag, and unfortunately it has risen to about $12 a bag now. So I do watch for flour to be on sale at some of our local grocery stores, and sometimes I'll buy that too. I don't ever sift my flour before I use it, either in to feed my starter or when I'm mixing it up in the bowl. Um, I have tried that once and it seemed to not really make much difference, and it was just an extra step that I didn't really feel was necessary. So I do not personally sift my flour just because there are so many steps, especially in stage 2 of the process. I like to keep track of my steps on a note in my iPad. This picture that I use for it was actually my first very good loaf that ended up looking like a loaf of sourdough is supposed to look like. So I like to keep that as my as a photo in my note, just to remind me that persistence did finally pay off. So in my note, I have all of my instructions written out. I actually don't read through my instructions anymore just because I have done this so much that I do know how to do it without referring to my instructions. But I do still use my note every time I make a loaf, just because that stage 2 has so many steps in it that I would lose track of which stretch and fold I have been on. So my first step was actually last night when I pulled my starter and my flour out of the freezer. So that was my first step. And now I have just done the step where I fed my starter and have it stored in my hot and humid microwave to get frothy. And the timing of that all depends on how hot and humid I can keep my microwave. So I took my starter out, reheated my water to get it nice and hot and humid in there, and now I'll just put this back in and I'll set my timer and reheat it again in about 30 minutes or so. And while I'm waiting, I'll stir my salt water to try and get a little bit more of it to dissolve. I fed my starter about 2 hours ago, and you can see it's just kind of starting to get a little bit frothy, but I'm going to continue to reheat my microwave, and hopefully we'll speed this process along a little bit more. It's been about 4 hours now since I fed my starter, and it hasn't quite gotten to the point that it's doubled yet, so I'm going to let it go a little bit longer before I start mixing it up. Here's a fun time-lapse video that I took a couple years ago. I love watching how bubbly and active it gets at the end. Okay, so it did take a little bit longer for my starter to get frothy enough to double in size. So now it's been about 6 hours since I fed it, and you can see that it is about double in size from where the rubber band is. This is step 2 of the process, where we mix our frothy starter with flour, water, salt water, and then start our stretch and folds. So I have my 2¼ cups of water in my bowl already, and I'm using reverse osmosis water for this. And I'll take my jar of starter and dump about a cup of the frothy liquid into it. And I'll end up leaving about 2 tablespoons or so in the jar. And I'll scrape it all down so that it all settles down in the bottom. So it's probably about halfway up to the rubber band now. And as that cools down, as it sits in the fridge, then it'll kind of drop even more. So I just put my lid on it and I put it back in the fridge until the next time I'm going to use it. So I'll pour my cup of frothy starter into the water. And then I'll just mix it up. And at this point, it just looks like a bowl of milk. So to this, I'm going to add 6 cups of flour. I don't get real specific on an exact measurement of my flour. I just use 6 cups and I just scoop it right out of the bag. I don't weigh it. I don't measure exactly. It's just guesstimates. And as you could see from the frothy starter that I added, that was not an exact measurement either. It was not exactly 1 cup, and I didn't measure it either. I just kind of wing it on my measurements. And I don't stir this up to get it completely incorporated. I get it to where it's what I call a shaggy ball, where it's just kind of pretty much covered in flour, but not fully incorporated. So this is about the point that I just leave it, because it will quickly change consistency as we go along. I don't add the salt water until my timer goes off in 45 minutes. And in the meantime, I put the lid on it and I rewarm my microwave and put it back in there and set my timer for 45 minutes. My microwave is nice and humid and hot in there again, and that's where we'll put the bowl from now on to continue its process. That's the point where I need my list on my notes app to help me keep track of where I'm at and how many stretch and fold processes I have done. After adding the frothy starter and flour to the water, and mixing it up, then I check off that step in my notes app. Okay, the next step in our phase 2 is to add our salt water mix. I will also reheat my microwave and get it hot and humid in there again. So you can see how it's gotten a little bit more wet since I mixed it up last. And here's the salt water that did not completely dissolve, but that's okay. It never does anyway. So I'll mix this up. And then I poured around the outside of the bowl just to help get it down into the bottom of the bowl a little bit more. And then I scrape out whatever doesn't dissolve. So from now on, every time I mix my bread, I want to have wet hands, because then it won't stick to my hands as much. So I like to pull it away from the bowl. And then I just start mushing it all together, get that salt incorporated in there. You can see on the bottom side of it, there's a little bit of the flour that didn't quite get mixed up yet. So if I find any big chunks, I just kind of squish those out. I thought that sifting my flour ahead of time would help with that, and the one time I tried that, it did not help with the lumps at all, so I just decided to not sift the flour anymore. So I just kind of mix it all up, do a little bit of a stretch and fold there, but not quite like we'll do the next time. And then if it starts to stick too much, then I'll get my hands wet again, and then I'll cover it and put it back in my reheated microwave oven and set my timer for 45 minutes. Okay, so our next step is going to be the first of our actual stretch and fold. So I'm going to check that one off on my list, and I'll get the dough out of the warm microwave and I will reheat that in a second. This is a situation where you can see it's getting a lot different than what it was, and so now it's going to get stickier, so I'm going to keep my hands wet while I do this. And to do the stretch and fold, I just grab a section of it, pull it up, and fold it over itself, turn it a little bit, grab another section, fold it over itself. And once I get all the way around, I kind of tuck that in a little bit, and I'll put it back in the microwave for another 45 minutes. Okay, after 45 minutes, I'm going to check off another stretch and fold off of the list just to keep track of how many I've done so far. And again, I'll want to get my hands wet because it's going to get sticky. You can see it's kind of changing consistency again. Just start where I left off last time. You can see where my last stretch and fold was. I'll just pull it and fold it over itself. And tuck it under, cover it, and put it back in the rewarmed microwave for 45 minutes. Okay, our third stretch and fold, I'm gonna check that one off and do the same thing as before. It's starting to get a little bit bigger, a little bit more jello-y, and I'll just start where I left off last time. Tuck it back under and put it back in my rewarmed microwave. The fourth and fifth stretch and folds are going to be a little bit different than what we have already done. So I'm going to go ahead and check off the fourth one that we're going to do. So what I'm going to do now is what's called a coil fold. So I'm going to loosen it from the bowl. Keeping my hands wet. And then I'm just going to lift it up in the center and let it fold on itself like that. Turn the bowl 180 degrees and do the same thing. And then turn it 90 degrees. Fold it again. And 180 degrees. And fold it again. And then just make sure that the seam side is down. Then again, I'll let it sit in the rewarmed microwave for 45 minutes. The last stretch and fold that I'll do is just like the last one, the coil fold. You can see how jello-y it's getting and how much bigger it's gotten over the last several hours. So again, I want to use wet hands and pull it away from the bowl. Pull it up in the center. Turn it 180 degrees. Pull it up in the center again. Turn it 90 degrees. So I want that seam to kind of be on the bottom. So I'll let this sit without the lid on it for about 10 minutes to help get a skin formed on the top of it before I move it to my slab of granite to do some shaping. It's been about 15 minutes now. It's a little bit sticky, but it has a skin on the top. So now I'm going to flour my granite surface. And my bench scraper. And my hands. I'm going to dump the loaf out onto my floured surface. And I'll just kind of scoop any excess flour underneath just to make sure that that bottom side is completely covered in flour. I'm going to flip the whole thing over onto a non-floured surface. Kind of spread the flour out a little bit all over the top. And then I'm going to take my bench scraper and just start kind of bringing it towards me as I'm kind of rotating it also. And then from here, I'm going to start from the bottom right side and go up and towards me, and up and towards me, and up and towards me. And do that about 4 or 5 times just to get some surface tension. You don't really want to do it too many times, because if you break your surface tension, then you'll lose the shape of it and it'll just kind of go all over like it did when I first dumped it out onto the floured surface. So I kind of make sure that it's all tucked in underneath, and I move it up into that corner. And then I take my extra flour and I put that on top and spread it around. And then I cover it with saran wrap. And let it sit for another 30 minutes. Okay, it has now been about 12 hours since I first fed my starter, so we're only partially done with the process. The rest will have to wait until tomorrow after this last step for the night. I'm basically going to repeat what I have just done, but I will add flour to the top of it and smooth it over the top. Then I'm going to take my bench scraper and kind of loosen it from the granite slab. And then I'm going to pick the whole thing up and flip it over. And you can see here, if you break your surface tension during this stage of it, this is basically what it's going to do, because it'll just kind of ooze out all over. So now at this point, I want to take the bottom section of it and flip it up about halfway, and flip each side over about a third of the way, and then flip the top side over all of it and roll it onto the seams so that the seam is on the bottom. And then I want to do the same push and pull about 4 times. And then again, just kind of shove it underneath to give it a good seal. Make sure that that seam is nice and snug on the bottom. I have a piece of parchment paper out here. Get it wet and scoop my loaf onto the parchment paper. I want this to be an oversized piece of parchment paper because I am going to use this in my Dutch oven when I bake it in the morning. Once the parchment paper and the loaf are back in the bowl, I will put the lid on it and put it in the fridge, and that will be stage 3. Then I will bake it in the morning. But I'm going to get my oven set up tonight so that it can start warming up when I wake up in the morning, and I'll come out here and it'll be hot enough to put my loaf in right away. That involves putting my cast iron pan in the oven, and I put a piece of foil on the bottom rack. I have my oven set up and ready to start heating in the morning when I wake up. I have it set at 475. It's going to start at 545, and I like to warm my cast iron Dutch oven for about 45 minutes before I put my bread in. So we'll be back in the morning to bake this loaf of bread. It's 9:15 in the morning now, and stage 3 ended up lasting a little bit longer than I had planned just because I kind of decided that 5:45 was a little too early to be camera ready. So I reset the time for my oven to start automatically, and it started at about 8:30, and now it is 9:15 and ready for stage 4 of baking the bread. So my pan is nice and hot at 475 degrees. I'm going to take my hot pan out, and I use cornmeal in the bottom of my pan just to kind of give a little bit of a barrier. Then I take a super sharp knife and I score the top of my bread. Because my name is Valerie, my signature score is just a V. That's how I score my bread. And then to give it some humidity in the pan, I spray it until the top is fully wet. And I take the parchment paper and put it right into the pan. And I always wrap the paper around the handles so that I know exactly where the handles are. Yes, my pan is actually chipping its ceramic coating off. I don't use this pan for anything other than bread, and the bread never comes in contact with it, so there is no threat of getting the ceramic coating onto the bread at all while it's baking. So I don't use it for soup or stews or anything like that. It's just strictly a bread baking pot. Then I put it in the oven. And I bake it for 47 minutes. I leave the lid on it the whole time. It does end up with the perfect crust. Okay, it's been 47 minutes. Let's check out the oven spring and see what it looks like. That looks pretty good. About 23 hours later, here is a perfect loaf of bread. You hear that nice hollow sound. You can see where the seam sat on the bottom of it, and it's a beautiful loaf of bread. We'll let it cool off, and then we'll toast it up and see how it tastes. If you live in central Nebraska and know that you don't have the time or patience to make your own loaf of sourdough, get in touch with me, and if the timing is right for both of us, I'll let you know my price. I took my loaf out of the oven about 4 hours ago, so it's cooled down enough that we can cut it. So because this loaf is about 3.5 to 4 pounds, it's fairly heavy, and there's a lot of it there. I tend to freeze about half of it at a time or give away to my family members or to our sons in college. So the easiest way that I have found to cut and store this bread is to cut it into quarters. So I'm going to cut it in half and we'll check out the crumb. That looks beautiful and it smells wonderful. So each of these halves, I'll just cut it in half again. So 2 of these quarters will go into a gallon size food saver bag that I'll seal with my food saver doodad. And then I'll put those in the freezer. I seal it down as much as I can without it squishing the bread. The other 2/4 I will keep in my bread box, and usually doesn't take more than a couple days for us to eat through these 2/4. And our favorite way to eat it is to just toast it. We feel that toasting it brings out a lot more flavor than just eating it as bread, which we do like it as bread also, especially when it's fresh like this. But putting it in the toaster just kind of brings out a little bit extra flavor that we really, really like. I like to run it through the toaster twice on a very low setting. It just makes it so it's nice and crispy and the perfect piece of toast. All right. You can see it's just slightly golden on the sides. Very hot. Okay, let's give it a try. Mmm, perfection.